a comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think I've got that all right. CPTPP, the pithily named trade agreement between 11 Pacific countries and the UK's ambitions to join it. The CPTPP started out as a set of discussions, I think, going right between Singapore and New Zealand, and gradually expanded to its peak when President Obama conceived of it as a way to contain and encourage better trade behavior from China. Unfortunately, TPP, as it was then known, became a casualty of American electoral politics, and it was almost Trump's first act to withdraw the US from it. But the other countries carried on regardless. It was renamed CPTPP, and it now comprises 11 nations with a combined GDP of $13.5 trillion. If the UK successfully accedes to it, it would boost that by about 20%. So here with me to discuss that topic, we have a stellar panel of people who have been involved in trade and politics in member countries plus the UK for a very long time. And we are going to start, each of the panelists is going to give about a 5-minute introductory remarks, and then we're going to go to questions from you, the audience, and perhaps I'll sneak in a few questions as well if I can. I should say also that we are spanning about 14 time zones at the moment. So good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everyone watching. So without further ado, to kick us off is Tony Abbott, who was the 28th Prime Minister of Australia. Tony.
Well, thank you so much, Juliet, and thanks to my fellow panellists. It's a pleasure and a privilege and an honour to join you. Could I just say to Britain and to the British participants, congratulations on the Brexit decision. I don't see Britain as leaving the European Union so much as rejoining the wider world. And obviously, this discussion would be impossible were Britain still within the EU. I want to make just a few very simple points. First, more trade generally means more prosperity, and almost axiomatically, more trade is a good thing. Second, more trade between countries with comparable standards of living and respect for the rule of law generally means much more prosperity. That's an even better thing. And I probably should point out that under the free trade deals that my government concluded between Australia and Japan and Australia and China, Australia's exports to both those very large markets increased just in the last few years by in the order of 40%. Next point I want to make is that a free trade agreement between Australia and the United Kingdom would be a very fine thing, and it certainly should be one of the easiest free trade deals ever to conclude. Currently, the United Kingdom is Australia's 5th biggest two-way trading partner, but given that the United Kingdom used to be by far our biggest trade partner, it's all upside as far as trade between Britain and Australia is concerned. The United Kingdom joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be very good for the wider world because with the United Kingdom in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it would comprise 5 G20 economies, Japan, Canada, Australia, and Mexico, with the United Kingdom, on most measures the world's 5th biggest economy, and it would make the Trans-Pacific Partnership by a margin, not a wide one, but a margin, the biggest free trade grouping, just edging out the EU. Because the United Kingdom and Australia are complementary economies with comparable standards of living and with very similar standards of behaviour and expectation, a free trade deal between Australia and Britain should be very, very easy to negotiate. And Liz Truss, I hope that's been your experience so far, that the negotiations are proceeding very smoothly. I would like to see a deal between Britain and Australia that makes trade in goods entirely free of tariffs and quotas, that provides for full mutual recognition of standards and credentials and qualifications, and provides for free movement of people for work at good wages and not welfare, subject only to a generous quota. I've got to say that Britain's joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be the best possible sign that Britain really does want to be a global country again. And the final point I want to make is that given the dramatic drop in global GDP brought about by the corona crisis, it's absolutely urgent that we do everything we humanly can to kickstart our economies, and a free trade deal between Britain and Australia would help. And not only doing that, but getting Britain into the Trans-Pacific Partnership would help even more. So I think it's a wonderful project that we're discussing tonight, and let's do everything we can to get it going as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you very much. We're now going to go to Chan Singh, who's the Minister for Trade and Industry in Singapore, who is, we greatly appreciate he's joining us in the midst of an election campaign. So thank you very much, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Juliet. I must thank Liz for inviting me as well. Good to see you again, Liz. Actually, I've discussed this with Liz some time back, and Singapore welcomes UK's interest to participate in the CPTPP, and we look forward to seeing how we can facilitate your discussions with the other CPTPP partners. But today, perhaps I'll just share 3 sets of considerations with the participants of the webinars from the UK's perspective. I think first, there are geostrategic considerations. Second, there are economic and business considerations. And third, there are domestic considerations from the UK perspective. Let me start from the geostrategic perspective. I think CPTPP should be seen more than just a pure economic arrangements. It actually will stand for what UK believes in engaging the world. I mean, more and more often now we hear us talking not just about Great Britain, but global Britain. And if we are indeed true to our words that we want the UK to be global Britain, then the CPTPP is a geostrategic arrangements. And if we look at the arc of history, ever since the 1967, the British withdrawal east of the Suez, I think the British have lost ground globally, and this is an opportunity for the UK to relook at its global geostrategic priorities. And I would seriously suggest that the UK has geostrategic priorities and interests around different parts of the world, particularly in the Asia Pacific. It has historical links with this part of the world, which it should not cede, and it should continue to build on that foundation. And if I may, then that leads to the second set of considerations, which is UK's business and economic interests. The UK has substantial business interests in the Asia Pacific since the last century. And even today, as we speak, the UK's businesses are doing very well in Asia Pacific. And Asia Pacific will be one of the fastest growth areas in the coming decades. And it will be remiss of the UK to not tap on this opportunity, particularly in a post-COVID world, in a world where there's rising protectionism, in a world where the global supply chains are fragmenting. So if you look at it, whether is it from a business opportunities perspective or enhancing the supply chain resilience of the UK, it makes absolute sense for the UK to diversify its trade links with different parts of the world, particularly the Asia Pacific part of the world. Now, having dealt with the geostrategic considerations and the business and economic considerations, I think we must be frank with ourselves that there's a third consideration, which is the domestic adjustments necessary. I've always said this, that with any trade agreements, it will require the government to help its domestic businesses and workers adapt. If businesses and workers are unable to adapt, there will be a local pushback against trade agreements, globalization, and further integration with the global economy. And this local pushback must be dealt with decisively, otherwise we risk global consequences. And we have seen this in many countries. Many countries, many economies are unable to get onto the free trade agreements because they are unable to deal with the domestic issues. And this is something that we must not ignore. But having said that, from Singapore's experience, the more you get into this, the easier it will be. It's always difficult for the first one or two because you need to make quite a number of adjustments to the domestic situation. But the more you do, I think the easier it is. For Singapore, we have more than 90% of our exports covered by free trade agreements. And today, for us to sign another free trade agreement with another country is actually much easier. And my last point is that I would also suggest that we be realistic in the pace which we deal with this. Just to follow up on a point that the Honorable Tony Abbott made. If doing it with 11 countries is difficult, then the UK can perhaps consider having the building blocks with some of the Asia-Pacific countries, which will make it easier for it to build momentum. Countries like Australia and Singapore have been strategic partners with the UK for very long, and we do not have many domestic constituencies that will object to closer trading relationships with the UK. And this can be a basis for us to build momentum towards the eventual CPTPP. So I look forward to discussing some of this with the panelists later. Thank you very much, Juliet.
Thank you very much. One thing I had forgotten to mention is also, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will have our panelists answering your questions once we have gone through them all. So thank you very much for those words of advice. We're now going to go to Lord Mandelson, who was the former First Secretary of State in the UK and former European Commissioner for Trade. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join the panel today. It's a great pleasure for me to do so. Let me make sort of three fairly brisk points, if I may, about this. The first was that the partnership, when it was TPP, and still to a only slightly lesser degree now, without the US, is a geostrategic framework, as Tony Abbott and Minister Chun have said. It's no less important for that. Essentially, it was designed to create a liberalized market on China's Pacific doorstep, in which the price of entry for China, should it ever consider joining, would be signing up to the rule frameworks that originally came with its tariff cuts when it entered the WTO, the IP disciplines, the regulatory disciplines, and other disciplines that come with WTO membership. Basically, all the things in which China has been rather disappointingly slow in implementing. Now, alongside that, to some degree, the deal has also become a sort of rebuff to the US itself. It is Japan and others saying, we don't need the US to continue organizing ourselves in the way we need to do. And I think that's valid, and I think it's welcome, and I think Japan's role is particularly creditable in translating from one to the other. I think UK accession might be seen as a helpful way in drawing the United States back in. Now, these factors need considering in a UK request for entry. They're not prohibitive, they're not barriers in any sense at all. And I think that the UK aligning itself with a Pacific Rim agenda of this kind is a good thing. There are liberalization gains to be made. But the key point I'd like to make in the first instance is that this deal should be seen as somewhat more than a question of gains from tariff cuts, which would probably be modest, quite frankly, although useful enough to have. I think it should be seen as a path towards other developments, for example, in services and digital trade, where frankly progress is easier to make in plurilateral agreements than through multilateral negotiation, as for example, the digital economy agreement between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand has demonstrated. Second point I'd like to make is that the partnership is an open architecture framework, unlike any other kind of arrangement that the UK might seek to join. It is in effect both a plurilateral and a bilateral deal, in the sense that the UK will have to negotiate entry with each country party, as well as with the group as a whole. Now, this means that it shouldn't be seen as an easy route to tariff liberalization in these markets, although it need not be any harder than 11 standalone deals either. However, the material point about this, and I think we need to be realistic about it, is that this probably takes time, even assuming the UK is a priority for all these different markets and countries. Key point, this is a strategic, medium-term strategic priority for the UK. It is not a quick win for the UK. Third, as I've alluded to, it is possible that the US seeks to rejoin the partnership in the future. Now, being inside the package, and I'm talking from a UK point of view here, being inside this package when the US does probably will make for a materially simpler route to tariff elimination in the United States, with less focus, frankly, for us on tricky regulatory and food standards questions, i.e. we can get to the same sort of end place that we want to get to in a deal with the US via this partnership than bilaterally without taking on those tricky issues. And so the key point I want to make is that this partnership has to be seen as part of the UK's US strategy. If we were not, frankly, in such a political hurry to get a deal with the US for obvious optical reasons, this might be a more circuitous but politically savvy way to get there, albeit far from guaranteed, without having to take on, as I say, those tricky agricultural and regulatory food standards issues. Let me make a last point about Britain's wider Asia strategy, if I may. The main thing about almost all of emerging Asia Pacific is that we in the UK have to have a strategy that is more than just about FTA negotiations. I want to underline this, if I may. These can be obviously high tariff markets, Malaysia and others, and FTAs are obviously useful in that respect, in capturing tariff reduction or elimination, liberalization gains. But the reality is that often a key for UK firms will be as much conditions for establishment locally to manufacture and to sell more goods and services than, frankly, removing trade barriers. In other words, our whole approach in Britain needs to focus as much on the investment strategy of UK corporates as much as the trade policy strategy of the UK government. And this area of investment and establishment is often where FTAs are much less important than pursuing a consistent regulatory diplomacy to improve local investment and regulatory conditions and to improve the capacity and sophistication of local governments, of courts, procurement markets, and capital markets. So this is about the long, hard slog of commercial diplomacy. And just remember this, if I may, in conclusion. UK firms are already ubiquitous, throughout the East Asian markets. And pretty much none of that presence was secured through FTAs. Almost, well, I won't say none, but not a huge amount. It was secured by commercial nous, being well positioned to take advantage of local reform and building out from local operations regionally. So the key point I would like to make in conclusion is that FTAs must be flanked by regulatory and commercial diplomacy, which has, in my opinion, to take equal priority alongside negotiations for FTAs of the sort that we're discussing today.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to hear from Liz Truss, who is the UK Secretary of State for International Trade.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. And as we chart our course now as an independent trading nation, it's fantastic to have on today's panel two big supporters of those ambitions, Tony Abbott and Stephen Harper, who have both secured many free trade agreements for their own nations and I think provide an example and route map for the UK as we move forward, and also to Minister Chun, who I've been working very closely with to promote free trade as we see increasing protectionist voices through the coronavirus crisis. We've heard a lot over the last week or so about FDR's New Deal and our plans to level up the United Kingdom. So I thought I'd talk today about a bit of history myself, explain how it relates to modern day international trade and British aspiration. FDR's New Deal was born after an era of unprecedented protectionism, where we saw barriers rise across the world and lead into a prolonged global recession. Not only did FDR sweep all before him with the New Deal, but what he also did was he rolled back tariffs and he ushered in an era of international cooperation. So if we're looking to FDR for some do's, I also think we should look to President Hoover for some don'ts. During the Great Depression, tariffs were raised on over 20,000 goods, and impossibly high barriers to trade were erected. And it's estimated that American imports and exports during that time fell by 70%. And almost 100 years on, as we again try and recover from a very serious crisis, I believe it's vitally important that voices of free trade are heard and that we resist these calls for protectionism. And I think the UK has a very important role to play as a newly emerging independent trading nation. So my ambition and the government's ambition is for Britain to be a fierce campaigner for free trade, an optimistic, forward-facing country that looks beyond its own shores. And we have a new opportunity to do that, having left the European Union. And if you look at the patterns of our trade, since 2001, the value of the UK's trade with the rest of the world has grown 60 percentage points more than the value of our trade with the EU. But what we want to do is go further and faster. So right now, we're currently negotiating free trade agreements with the United States, with Japan, with Australia and New Zealand. And we've got a team of negotiators working round the clock to make this happen. But I see this as part of a broader strategy of the UK becoming a central hub in a network of free trade agreements. A networked Britain, if you like, rather than a fortress Britain. And I think we're in a very strong position to lead that fight against protectionism with our allies and to lead by example through this new network of free trade agreements. It's a very important principle for us that we're working with like-minded nations, countries who have high standards and who importantly play by the rules. And what we will do is we'll be able to challenge those who don't play by the rules, and we'll be able to force those nations to up their game. And there are, of course, as there always are, some protectionist voices, but what I would say to them is that we have been through an era where British business has been cut out of opportunities. We haven't had the trading opportunities we could have had, particularly with those fast-growing parts of the world. And these free trade agreements are a vital part of reducing those barriers, but also protecting us against protectionism by making sure we keep tariffs and barriers low. But of all the opportunities I see, I think CPTPP is one of the greatest. It covers 13% of the global economy. If you add the UK, that would be 16%. And together with USMCA, that means that almost 40% of the global economy would be covered by high standards, rules-based, modern trade agreements. Membership of CPTPP would hitch the UK to the fast-growing Pacific region, and it also helps us strengthen our ties with some of our key international allies like Canada, Singapore, and Australia, who are all represented on today's call. This, to me, is about strengthening the group of countries that believe in free trade, but also believe in the rules-based global system. Now, of course, as people have mentioned on this call, it's important that we make sure we gain and keep the support of the British public for those trade deals we're looking to strike. They must benefit British families, jobs and businesses. We won't compromise on our high food standards, and they must share wealth across our country as part of our levelling up agenda. I also think it's important to recognise that these benefits that we could gain by joining CPTPP, we wouldn't have been able to access as a member of the European Union. And we'll be able to accede to this agreement in ways that doesn't damage our national sovereignty. There is no ECJ or harmonisation of domestic regulation, and there's no ceding of our sovereign powers. What it allows us to do is be part of a modern rules-based free trade area. And it enables us to sign up to advanced digital provisions, in effect, become part of a digital free trade area. And I think that's incredibly important for the UK. We are third in the world in terms of our number of billion-dollar tech companies after the US and China. It is a real comparative advantage for us. And the fact is that services and digital trade, we haven't seen the progress we should have done at the World Trade Organization. The rule book was invented in 1995 before this trade has fully developed, and it hasn't yet moved forward sufficiently. I believe by becoming part of CPTPP and by signing up to these advanced agreements in areas like services and digital, we will help push the World Trade Organization to adopt new rules and to modernize its rulebook, particularly in these types of areas. And of course, we want to see a reformed WTO. We want to see, there's obviously the appointment of the new Director General coming up. We want to see leadership which promotes those ideas. But at the same time, we also need to pursue the plurilateral approach to put pressure on that organization to reform. And CPTPP is very much part of that plan. Over the coming months, we are working with CPTPP countries to secure our accession. As I've mentioned, we're already pursuing bilateral agreements with Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and we're in discussions with a number of other CPTPP members. To my mind, the potential gains are enormous, and that is both economically and strategically. I believe that membership will deliver for our businesses, it will deliver for our people, and it will help turn Britain into a bulwark against protectionism and a country that fights for rules-based free trade and also helps advance it globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz Truss. And now we're going to hear from our last panelist, but not least, Stephen Harper, who was the 22nd Prime Minister of Canada, and he's now the chairman of the International Democrat Union, which is a grouping of conservatives across the world. Go ahead.
Thank you, Juliet. Thanks to the Policy Exchange for hosting this and inviting me to be part of such a distinguished panel. My government, the government I led, concluded the original TPP negotiations in 2015. At the time, that and a number of our trade agreements were opposed by our eventual successors who ultimately did join the pact. We can quote Oscar Wilde and say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but the most important thing here is that it shows that politically, free trade can be a winner. As I say, a number of these agreements were opposed, but in every single case, our successors adopted and implemented them. The original negotiations, as has been mentioned, were driven really by the United States after it joined. And the United States objective was not simply a free trade deal. It was to build a robust rules-based regime in the Asia Pacific as an alternative to a, for lack of a better term, a neo-mercantilist Chinese-centric managed trade system. We in Canada supported that objective, but our own aims were more modest. We wanted a trade deal with Japan, and we felt that this would be a more fruitful way of getting it than the bilateral relations, the bilateral negotiations that we had underway. But that was really the big prize for us. Also, on a defensive tact, we were worried that if we were not part of this, that NAFTA could become part of a US hub and spokes arrangement. So those were our objectives. I have to say, I did not think that the TPP, now CPTPP, would survive without the Americans. But really, it was Japanese determination and leadership with pretty important support from the Australians that really made that happen. The deal has only been in effect now for 18 months, but it is already an important membership, an important regional membership for Canada. We're seeing trade growth, and that's with, by the way, 3 of the 11 participants still not having actually ratified the pact. However, I think it's important to say a couple of things about the deal, just so people are aware of the specifics. This arrangement, as important as it is simply not the powerful geopolitical instrument it would have been with US membership. Last time I looked, just to put this in perspective, the United States economy is more than double the size of the 11 TPP members combined. So it is considerably smaller without the United States. Also, many of the provisions of the original TPP were suspended with US non-membership because they were important American objectives, and that's particularly in the intellectual property area, where it's much less comprehensive. In typical political fashion, this was renamed the Comprehensive TPP just as it became less comprehensive. But nevertheless, an important deal. Now, I can't speak for, obviously, any of the current governments, but my impression is that, there would be a lot of interest in seeing the British join this particular deal, which, I say, is an important part of a new rules-based global trade order, one that respects national sovereignty and is also outside of Chinese influence. The question, though, there are some important questions that I think Britain will have to ask itself as to where this really fits in its trade strategy. The government I led negotiated almost all of Canada's existing trade agreements. And our experience was that these things take a lot of time, and you have to determine your priorities. There's only so much bandwidth, and deals can have cross effects. there are most favored nation status provisions in many agreements. So in many cases, signing one agreement can make it very difficult to sign other agreements. So the UK is going to have limited negotiating resources, and it needs to move quickly. The UK is going to have to identify what are its offensive interests and what are its defensive red flags in a TPP pact. I don't know what those are. I would think that with Australia and New Zealand, there could be some in the agricultural area. The other thing I think the UK is going to have to look at carefully is the reality that joining a multilateral or plurilateral trade agreement is not, frankly, going to be a matter of a lot of negotiation. The others are going to have a largely take it or leave it approach. Otherwise, the negotiations will be extraordinarily slow. So I think that's a big decision for the UK. This can be done in a sense more quickly, but there's probably less room for trade-offs. Bilaterals can be tailored, but they take time, and they are rarely easy either. Maybe just a word, I was asked to say a bit of a word about UK-Canada. I would just say that I think in terms of trade relations between our two countries, a simple replication of CETA, the CETA terms, would be the easiest and most obvious way for Canada and the United Kingdom to secure a free trade agreement together. In other words, just do a simple rollover. I know that there are some who would like to see broader ambitions, but I guarantee you the farther you get from a simple rollover, the longer the process will take. And as I say, I don't think Britain really has a lot of time here. I do think Britain has to begin expanding its trade network pretty shortly after it enters the European Union. In any case, those are my, it exits the European Union. In any case, those are my thoughts, Juliet, and once again, pleased to be on this.
Great. Thank you very much to everyone. I think we'll go straight to audience questions, although I would like to ask one, but maybe I'll jump in later if there's time. I want to maximize the time for people watching to ask. And I think our first question is going to be from Lord Trenchard. Could you please wait for yourself to be unmuted and then restate your name and your organization before you ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is Hugh Trenchard, House of Lords, and delighted to be invited to ask a question. As the Secretary of State has said, the CPTPP comprises 11 countries, of which 6 are Commonwealth countries, sharing a commitment to rules-based free trade based on a mutual recognition of equivalence of outcomes in regulatory systems. And as Lord Mandelson rightly said, that to apply to CPTPP, even the act of having applied, even if it takes longer to accede, means that bilateral negotiations will be easier with the US, but I would suggest possibly, and ask the panel's opinions, also with Japan, particularly in the agricultural area. And Mr. Chan said, this isn't just about trade and investment, but there's also a security and strategic element. That's so important because people are asking what we're going to do to change our dependence, our too great reliance on China. And the more we do with others, including the CPTPP members, the less we will depend on developing more business with China. And for this reason, I would suggest and like to ask the panel's opinion, should it not be a near-term priority for the UK at least to apply to accede to CPTPP rather than the medium-term priority which Lord Mandelson suggested? Thank you.
Thank you. Is anyone dying to answer that first, either perhaps Lord Mandelson or Liz Truss? Oh, sorry, I think you need to be unmuted.
I didn't say it would be a medium-term priority. I said realistically, we are only going to be able to achieve this in the medium term. Slight difference here. I mean, as far as I know, the UK government has yet to publish even its scoping assessment for accession. I don't think the UK government has set out its negotiating objectives. So the process is yet to start. And as Stephen Harper said in his very realistic, almost sobering contribution, these things take time. And we will find that the existing members of the partnership will make some fairly tough demands of us, notably, but not only in relation to agriculture. Some may, adopt a take it or leave it attitude. So I just think, given that the process involves both bilateral building block sort of steps and then a final collective agreement and sign off, it is going to take time, and we have to be realistic about that. As far as China is concerned, I agree that what not only the United States and Europe need to do, but with partners and like-minded countries elsewhere, notably in Asia and Pacific, is work out a strategy which is, towards China, which can be collectively agreed, has some coherence, and is then consistently pursued, unlike, I would say, has been our experience in the last 4 years.
Liz Truss, would you like to respond to any of that and to the question asked?
Yes. So in terms of the process for CPTPP, of course, the bilateral negotiations with Japan, Australia and New Zealand, all three of those partners have supported our accession to CPTPP. And we see the bilateral negotiations as part of the process of CPTPP accession with those respective countries. We're also in discussions with the other of the 11 partner countries to do the precursor work. And that's the way accession works. You've got to do the precursor work with each of the 11 countries. Then comes the point of formal application. At that point, we would publish our scoping study, and then we would negotiate the 11 separate market access schedules. So that is the process, but we have got in principle agreement for support from all of the 11 countries. We are now in the stage of working that through in more detail with each of the 11 countries. We will then go to the stage of formal application, where we would then publish our negotiating objectives and the scoping study. So it is correct that 11 different market access schedules cannot be negotiated overnight, but I can assure Lord Trenchard that we are starting now with a view to getting to that point in as reasonable a time as we can do that. And it is a major strategic priority. And I think I've been clear that I don't just see this as an economic benefit, I see this as a geostrategic benefit, and also a signal of the type of modern free trade agreement and modern free trade area that the UK wants to be part of.
Thank you. I think Chan Chung Singh had something that he wanted to say as well. Please go ahead.
I'd just like to share a couple of points on practical matters that both Lord Mandelson and Honourable Stephen Harper has mentioned. The first point is this. Let's be very realistic. Any one of us is a small economy relative to US and China. Any one of us. For us to negotiate with US and China bilaterally is going to be an uphill task. We don't have very much bargaining power. But what we can do is to make sure we gather enough like-minded partners together before we approach the biggie, as you like. And I've always reminded ourselves that while the US and the Chinese economy is 1/3 of the world's economy, there's the other 2/3. And if the other 2/3 can get its act together, then it will have a much better bargaining position. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is this, exactly what the Honourable Stephen Harper said. And I think Lord Mandelson alluded to this. You need a strategy that requires us to build momentum and gather pace. Negotiating with 11 partners is always more difficult than negotiating with one partner. And we have to choose which are those 1 or two partners that can help us to generate momentum and build mass, if you like. Australia and Singapore are easy partners because the economic structures are relatively similar and we do not have many opposing domestic interests to overcome. But this is how, even for Singapore as a small economy, that's how we build momentum, gathering like-minded partners before we approach the bigger ones. And I think I would suggest that the UK would develop a similar strategies with similar like-minded partners and generate momentum. My third point is this, and that goes to why is it so important to generate momentum? And it's for a very practical reason. It's called bargaining power. Each on our own is very difficult to have bargaining power. But when we gather together, then it improves our bargaining power. And that's why the strategy of choosing your first few partners is so important. It is also very important because having left the UK now needs to rebuild an entire team of trade negotiators that is au fait with the issues at hand. And it is always easier to work with like-minded partners that are not too dissimilar before we get into the tougher thing. I mean, it's like playing sports, right? We all start with the easier ones first before we get on to the harder ones. And so those are my three suggestions for the UK to think about as you consider your options towards CPTPP, or CPTPP being one part of your overall trade and investment strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have a question from Richard Meredith. I think you have to unmute yourself. You should have a request to unmute your microphone if you can hit OK or yes to that. Also, to remind others that in order to put yourself in the queue to raise a question, you can hit the raise hand button, which I think should be below the near the bottom of your screen. Any luck with Richard Meredith? Okay, we're going to go to someone else. Maybe we'll come back to you if we can. We're going to go to Jonathan Moynihan.
Good afternoon, panel, and thank you so much for those very interesting remarks. And I'd like to congratulate Policy Exchange for bringing this together. It's really heartwarming to see conversations of this sort. My question was that...
Sorry, could you just mention your affiliation as well, please? If you
John Moynihan, private citizen.
Thank you.
My question is, as regards services rather than goods. It is the case that, as Lord Mandelson said, the gains on losses of tariffs will be good, but not necessarily huge. Services, let us say, for example, financial services, or indeed cultural interchanges, which I think will be tremendously important, visa regimes and the like. What opportunity is there, for example, for mutual equivalence or recognition of standards in financial services, whether bilaterally or on the larger deal? What opportunities are there for very significant increases in visas for musicians and the like?
Perhaps Liz Truss could tackle that one first from a UK point of view.
So, I mean, I agree. I think one of the many benefits of CPTPP is its very strong services and also digital chapters. In probably all of the negotiations, though, we'd want to go further bilaterally on some of those specific issues, particularly financial services, and we're looking at that with Japan at the moment. In terms of things like visa access and temporary entry, those tend to have to be negotiated separately, but it's certainly something we're looking at as part of a number of our free trade agreements. But for me, one of the biggest benefits of CPTPP is essentially this digital free trade area. And we have a very strong footprint already in terms of services exports. We're the #2 services exporter in the world after the US. And gaining access to this, major services market, I think is a real boon. One of the issues we have at the moment is that the economic valuation of FTAs is not particularly great around services. In fact, we just launched a project to look at how do we get a better evaluation of the potential benefits.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on services and CPTPP? No. Okay, well, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question, which is broadly to anyone who wants to answer it, which is how you think the UK's accession would reshape CPTPP, given the UK's economy and its priorities, both economically, but also strategically and geopolitically. And whether, Stephen Harper, I think you said that it will be a take it or leave it deal, but just before Canada actually signed the agreement, it managed to get some last minute concessions on motor exports, if I'm right. So perhaps the UK could, given its relative size of being a decent size compared to some of the other members, perhaps it could get some concessions there.
Yeah, good question. Canada's concession should not be exaggerated. The most important concessions we got was when we were part of the original negotiations. Most of the changes made later were made around the reality that the United States was not at the table. But look, I would say that Britain joining would offer some significant advantages. This would go from being a purely regional pact to now being the beginning of an alternative global order. Britain is not just a large economy, but it's also not an Asia-Pacific economy. So there would be a qualitative change in the deal. And that would be very important for the organization. I also think there is some truth in the argument that this would lay a better groundwork for eventual American membership, although I think practically speaking, we're a long way from that. So look, I think the UK has some things to offer, but look, here's the trade-off. It's not that the United Kingdom could not get some tailor-made provisions or some individual concessions, but those things will add time to the process. Liz has already outlined the process. The process is not easy. None of these things are easy. The government I was part of, we signed trade agreements with 46 countries. The shortest time frame to conclude any of those was a little over 2 years. In the case of our deal with the European Union, we had 2 years of pre-study, 7 years of negotiation, and my successors had 3 years of implementation. So, I think the UK has a need to expand its network leaving the European Union fairly quickly. And yes, you can seek more tailor-made provisions, but that will add time to what will be a long process.
Thank you. I think Peter Mandelson wanted to comment as well.
There we are.
There we go.
I just wanted to make 2 comments. First of all, I think it is very desirable that the partnership is expanded in scope to re-include, to re-embrace those aspects of it that were dropped after the US left. The exceptions that were made during that transition relate to the investment chapter and to intellectual property protections, patent and data protection and issues like that. I think that a modern 21st century trade agreement needs to bring those things back. And I would hope that Britain's role or influence eventually within the partnership will help that pursuit. Secondly, I think it is desirable to try and bring the United States back into this partnership. not only because it would strengthen it vis-a-vis China. I mean, it would grow its entire weight and meaning in the way that Stephen Harper has described. But it would also bring the United States back into a system of rules-based trade. It would bring the United States back into a collective effort to strengthen the rules-based trade system. But that has to be, in my view, not only a gain in itself plurilaterally for that sizable number of members of the partnership itself, but it has to be a platform for strengthening and reforming and modernizing the World Trade Organization itself. And I would see the United States, in a sense, coming back into that sort of coalition, that constellation of countries, as a very important step towards its reassuming what I hope it will do, reassuming its global leadership role in the multilateral system, and notably in the WTO. Obviously, that begs a number of questions about the WTO. Is it fit for purpose? Is it now so sort of degraded in its role and its effectiveness? Can it ever be sort of, rescued, pulled up and put back on its feet? Well, I strongly believe that it can be, and I think it's an absolutely essential organization for those of us who believe in the principles and the values that underpin free trade internationally. Obviously, to do that with the WTO requires effective leadership. It requires, as Liz Truss has said, a heavyweight political figure who can lead the WTO rather than simply a diplomat or a technician, a real believer in trade liberalization, because a lot of the people who make the WTO operate are not actually at heart trade liberalizers. And yet they maintain their positions there. And I think the leadership of the organization needs somebody who truly believes in trade liberalization and who is a dedicated reformer, who knows that the WTO rulebook has to be updated, modernized, and made fit for the 21st century. Now, if that sounds like a job application, then I make no apology for that. It is. I'd love to do the job, but of course that requires the nomination by my own government in the first place. But I think that this is a really important objective. You create plurilateral trade agreements and organizations as a stepping stone to recreating and reasserting the rules-based multilateral system itself. And that's the wider long-term view that I think we should bear in mind in this discussion.
I better give Liz Truss a very quick chance to answer. Any chance of a nomination for Peter Mandelson here?
Tragically,
the UK has yet to decide our position on the WTO DG. But what I would point out is that any successful candidate would essentially need the support of the US, China, and the EU. So as well as being a political heavy hitter and somebody who is a champion of the free trade agenda, it does need to command the support of all of those blocs.
Well, that wasn't a no, so maybe you can keep your hopes up. And I think that Tony Abbott wanted to come in perhaps briefly, because I'd love to squeeze in one more question from the audience after that. So go ahead, Tony Abbott.
Thanks. Well, Liz, if the successful candidate needs the support of China, the United States and Europe, that probably rules any of us out. So look, just a couple of very quick observations. Peter, of course, it would be wonderful if the US could be brought back into the TPP. But at the moment, the US seems to have not the slightest interest in joining. whereas Britain does have a great deal of interest in joining, and the major TPP countries have a great interest in getting Britain in. And I think we probably should try to focus on things which are currently realistic rather than on things that are currently unrealistic. But a couple more points. Look, Australia is a relatively small economy, about the 12th largest in the world, but we've actually got free trade deals with China and the United States. And on the point of momentum, we actually brought our negotiations to a successful conclusion with Korea, Japan, and with China within the space of a few months. And the way we were able to do that, I think, was by focusing on what was relatively achievable rather than on what would be ideal in a perfect world. And I think this is yet another situation where the best is the enemy of the good. And I would much, much rather get something that is good and an improvement than hold out for something which is ideal, but which is unrealisable.
So I think we're going to go to, Liz Truss, did you want to say something very quickly?
I do want to agree with Tony's point about the ability of countries to strike trade deals. And the US deal that Australia got is actually a very good one and a good precursor agreement that I know a lot of countries look at. And I do think Australia and New Zealand are both fantastic examples of trading nations who have been able to lead the world in terms of the ideas about free trade. And that's important, as well as the agreements themselves. It's making the case for liberal free trade rules and the rules-based system.
Great, and now we, oh, sorry, go on briefly if you can.
If I may just chime in on 2 points on being realistic. The first point is that the longer you wait, the harder you will be. Because as more and more people join the CPTPP, it will be harder to get what you want. So that's the first point, in the spirit of realism. The second point, in the spirit of realism, is this. For high-end breakthrough agreements on the digital front or the financial services front, realistically, I think it's easier to do it with 1 or 2 partner countries than the whole CPTPP. That's because the 11 countries are so diverse and they have such disparate standards in such cutting-edge services agreements. It'll be very difficult to do so. So if the UK is seriously considering a financial services agreement or digital services agreement, I think partners like Singapore, Australia, that would be much easier to do.
Great, and we're going to squeeze in, we're running over a bit, but we're going to squeeze in one last question from John McTurnan. And please make your question very brief, and please everyone make your replies very brief.
Hi, it's John McTurnan. I am political strategist. I'm a colleague, former colleague of both Tony Abbott and Peter Mandelson. And my question is simply, what contribution would Britain joining this make to the broader challenge of reforming all of our multilateral institutions, the global multilateral institutions? Thanks.
Does Tony Abbott, you can lead us off.
Well, John, I'm delighted that you described me as a colleague. I suppose we were both involved in the Australian Parliament at the same time. But look, I've got to say that you've made a pretty strong contribution to Labor politics, both in your own country and in mine. So good on you for that. Look, Britain is, after the United States, the most important country in the West by, in my judgment, a long measure. And any British participation in any serious international body has got to be for the good of that body, the good of Britain and the good of the wider world. So I think the sooner Britain can be involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the better.
Great. Does anyone else want to come in? Peter, Liz Truss, yeah. Then
can I come in, Juliet? Well, I think it sends a strong signal about the type of modern trade agreement that Britain wants to be part of. And it gives added weight to those countries like Australia, Japan, and New Zealand and Singapore, who have long campaigned for these types of advanced, liberal, free trade, rules-based agreements. So I think it's about building the momentum towards changing the global trading system through a coalition of the willing. And I think that's very important. And I just wanted to briefly reply to Minister Chan's point about a sort of incrementalist approach to CPTPP. That's exactly the approach we're taking. We're currently in discussions with Singapore, of course, as well as with Australia, New Zealand and Japan. And the aim is to secure those bilateral deals in advance of eventual accession to CPTPP. But I just want to point out, we're not neglecting any of the CPTPP countries. We're in discussions with them, but of course, some of those discussions are at an earlier stage in those negotiations.
Thanks. And Peter Mandelson. Oh,
go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the only way in which you're going to get change and reform multilaterally is through coalitions of like-minded countries working together. And the more the plurilateral arrangements like the ones we're discussing today create habits of close working, of shared objectives, and of concerting what they do globally, the greater is the chance that you're going to achieve those reforms and those changes internationally. That doesn't, by the way, mean that, you know, we want a sort of coalition of the willing to confront China, decouple from China, place an economic iron curtain around China. That, of course, would be senseless for two reasons. One is that China, I'm afraid, has already risen and it's now too big to encircle, as it were. We have to come to terms with China and work out how we're going to deal with China, rather than imagine that we can arrest its growth. But secondly, because there are areas internationally where we need cooperation with China. Trade is one. You know, if we want a rules-based, effective rules-based international trading system, then as Liz has said, you know, we need Chinese buy-in to that. But you're only going, in my view, to get Chinese buy-in to that, or on climate change, or in other areas where international cooperation is needed, where China becomes alert to its options, but also the price it will pay and the downside of excluding itself from international agreement. And to make China aware of that is better achieved by like-minded nations concerting their positions and their messages to Beijing. And that's what, of course, I would like to see us do more effectively in the future.
Great. And I think we're going to go for a last word to Stephen Harper to wrap us up.
I guess I was going to say something very similar, Juliet. When we first took government, one of our big objectives, like the British government today, was to expand Canada's international free trade network. At that point, most of the bureaucracy's efforts were directed at the WTO. We concluded very early that if you wanted to make progress, you had to go bilaterally or regionally, and the WTO wasn't going to be the vehicle that was going to move things forward. I think that's as true today. By the way, I think it's true about a lot of things beyond trade. I think we're in an era where broad-based international cooperation through traditional institutions is increasingly difficult. And if your country wants to make progress, whether it's on trade or anything else, it's going to be coalitions of the willing and the like-minded that are going to make things happen for you. So yes, this strategy may advance reform to the international order, but what I would say to Britain and others is don't wait for that, just make it happen through a coalition of like-minded partners.
Great, and thank you to all our panelists and to everyone for watching. And at least I would like to make a bid that if the UK does join, that CPTPP can be renamed as something pithier. But thank you all for watching this Policy Exchange webinar. Good afternoon, good evening, or good night.